So this video, following on from my video of US history from the discovery of America by Christopher Columbus in 1492 up until 1650. This video follows on from that. Just to review what we learned in that last video, we learned that at the time that Christopher Columbus made this famous journey of exploration, that Europe was a pretty unhappy place. There was a lot of economic hardship. It was really no more advanced, perhaps even less advanced than that Athens in Greece was 2,500 years ago. It hadn't really advanced. As well as economic hardship, war, famine, disease, there was a lot of religious persecution. On top of that, Europe's valuable trade routes to Asia along the Silk Road had been interrupted with the rise of the Islamic Empire. So when Christopher Columbus made this famous journey, he wasn't actually looking for the new continent of America. He was rather hoping that by sailing west across the Atlantic, he could finally arrive in Asia. And indeed, when he arrived in America, he thought that he had found Asia and went back and told everyone the excitement of having found it. It took the Spanish quite a long time and took the Europeans quite a long time to realize that it wasn't Asia that he'd found, but this new continent of America. A number of other people explored America, not just Christopher Columbus, who went at the behest of the Spanish. We had the Portuguese, French, Dutch, English, all making explorations. Settlers were few to begin with. Spain was most interested in South America simply because they found gold there, gold in huge quantities. And this gold made Spain extremely wealthy. And Spain took over from Italy as the wealthiest country in Europe as a result of this this gold from South America. England was quite slow off the mark. The first settlers didn't arrive in America until about 100 years after Christopher Columbus discovered it. A lot of the GED syllabus about early settlers in America was about the English settlers. But that doesn't mean that there weren't settlers from other countries too. The reason why they focused most on the English settlers was that in time England came to dominate what's later called the 13 colonies, the 13 states on the east coast of America. The English settlers started down in Virginia, and we had the first settlement at Roanoke Island that didn't work. Then Jamestown, which did work. They grew tobacco successfully, set up a successful colony, and the House of Burgesses, very important in GED, was set up. More settlers came, landing further north in the US, just south of and just north of Boston. First, we had the Pilgrims, religiously persecuted. They came and set up their own colony just south of Boston. They came on a ship called the Mayflower. When they were on the Mayflower, they made an agreement about how they were going to run their colony called the Mayflower Compact. Very important in GED. Then the Puritans came, settled further north of Boston, in this area that became known as New England because so many English people came there. Very popular, was very successful. And so we leave then finally Maryland, which is just north of Virginia, where Jamestown was. The English king at the time, King Charles I, sets up another colony, and this is given for Catholics, again another religiously persecuted community. And the Catholics can go there and they can worship their own religion in Maryland in the US. So what that gives us is this situation of where everyone is. You can see at the top the French in Canada, Um, you can see the English that we talked about a lot in the last lecture filling out in New England. It looks like a smaller circle than the French one, the smaller oval than the French one, but actually there are a lot of English people there. Then just below them you can see the Dutch. That oval is probably drawn a little bit too big, actually. The Dutch community wasn't as big as that. It was much more around New York. And then further south from the Dutch, more English, the English that originally settled in Jamestown and grew from there. And on top of that, just north of Jamestown, Maryland, where there are English. And then below the English, there's a gap. And that's important, the gap, because there's going to be a lot of people thinking, oh, I'd quite like to own that gap. And then below the gap, you can see the Spanish occupying Florida. And you can see the Spanish actually occupied a lot of Central America, South America, and some of the west coast of the US. Within South America, the Portuguese also had a degree of control because they controlled Brazil. Spain was more powerful than England. They probably didn't fancy too much of a war with Spain. But that was the situation. So the English were going to, looking at that map, they're going to be thinking, oh, we'd quite like to deal with this Dutch community. There's not that many of them, and it would be quite nice to join the two English communities up. And the English are also going to be thinking to themselves, this space between the English and the Spanish, this coastline, we'd quite like to control that. And that is, as we're going to see in this talk, exactly what they do. So the first thing they do is they occupy Carolina. And Carolina is part of this land south between the English and the Spanish. This area here, Carolina, this is what they want to occupy. And later they want to occupy Georgia, which is the bit even closer to Spain. But they take this first chunk here, just below the English chunk first. And King Charles I in 1663, the lovely thing in GED is you don't need to remember these dates and people. I just want you to see that England is playing this game, that they're filling in the spaces. And he's sending settlers to Carolina so England can occupy it. I also mentioned that England is anxious to own this area here, but there are Dutch already, so there's going to need to be a fight. And the king, who didn't like the Dutch having a colony between the two English colonies, in 1664 sent 4 naval ships. As I mentioned, the Dutch were not very powerful there. There weren't very many of them there. And they surrendered. And the king gave land to his brother James, Duke of York, and he kept some of it and renamed it New York. And the rest he gave to 2 friends, John Berkeley and James Carteret. Again, you don't need to know that. The important thing that I want you to know from this is that he took New York this is all part of the game of making all of this English. Here you can see what New York looked like in 1664 when the British took it. I hope it's clear for you. The picture is clear enough for you, but you can see a very simple, almost like a village, which was New York in 1664, where the Dutch were, and in New York today. Having taken New York, the area just south of New York is called New Jersey. So they needed to fill that in to get right up next to the English. And that is precisely what they did. So this land that John Berkeley and James Carteret had became called New Jersey. Neither of these people came to live in America. They probably were having rather nice lives in England and didn't fancy going and living in a new colony, but they sent people there to live. Um, and they sold off a lot of this land cheaply to new settlers, actually not only English new settlers, but they were good people, and they were selling it, they were land to people who needed political or religious freedoms. But even though some of these settlers were not English, it's important to know that the governors, the governors of this part of America were English. It was very much under English control. And another area in this band here, trying to secure this area, Pennsylvania, which is around here, which is just slightly inland, is around here. They wanted control of that as well. So Pennsylvania becomes another place where a colony is started. Like so many colonies, it's a religious colony. This was a Christian religious group called Quakers, and they wanted to start a colony. King Charles II owed money to Penn, and he, instead of paying him back, maybe because he didn't have the money, he thought, well, I'll give him land in America as payment. So this state in America, Pennsylvania, is actually named after William Penn. Then he got more land. Penn was given more land by the Duke of York, probably because the Duke of York also owed him money, which is now called Delaware. It's not important to remember these dates, these people. What's important to remember is that England was playing this clever game. They were trying to dominate this area here. They were trying to dominate as much of it as they could by getting rid of the Dutch, by bringing lots of settlers in and filling in these spaces, going all the way down to Carolina. So around 1730, you've got the English, and this circle probably goes a little bit too far inland, because on the left-hand side here, you've got a lot of American Indians and mountainous territory. But thinking about the coast, you've got the English dominating the coast down here, all the way down to South Carolina. You've got the Spanish in Florida, and very powerful in central South America. You've got the French here, and you've also got some French up further north. This bit between the English and the Spanish on the coast, Georgia, needs to be filled in. The English are worried about the Spanish taking Georgia. So it's no surprise that here we go, 1732, another king, King George II, decides, let's try and fill this in, because he wanted to make sure that the French and the Spanish didn't take it first. So he gives land for this colony to a man called James Oglethorpe. And James Oglethorpe appears in Georgia, and he has to be quite careful because he's bumping right up against Spain. And the way that the Spanish run their colonies is rather different to the English. But the English get Georgia first. He wisely names the colony after the king that gave it to him. So Georgia is named after George II. The people that came to this colony, many of the people that came to this colony were debtors, people in severe debt. What used to happen in those days in England is if you owed money and you couldn't pay it back, you could get sent to prison for life. If you couldn't pay your debts, you stayed in prison. So for many people who got into debt and couldn't pay it back, it meant the rest of their life spent in jail. What the colonists were given when they went to Georgia was they were given free land. They were allowed to leave prison and go there. However, there were strict rules. There was no alcohol allowed. No slaves were allowed. Slavery was starting to become more popular in the US. But in Georgia, at the beginning, slavery was not allowed. And also, they did not have freedom to make their own laws, which you had in a number of other American states. The reason why slavery was forbidden in Georgia is interesting. In Florida, which was owned by the Spanish, they didn't allow slavery. There was no slavery. Slavery was not allowed. So perhaps with Georgia being next door to Florida, they had to be a little bit careful about slaves. Georgia became a kind of buffer zone. It didn't last like this forever. As you'll see in later years, Georgia becomes a place where there really were a lot of slaves. So, with the settlement of Georgia, we had these 13 English colonies along the Atlantic coast, and Britain had achieved their aim. Their aim was, just going back to this slide that we've talked about a bit before, the aim was to fill in from the English in New England, to go all the way down to take the area that was owned by the Dutch. So New England, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, Pennsylvania, as English. And they did it. And with that came the emergence of the 13 colonies. And these 13 colonies were really the beginning of the United States. And this talk about the 13 colonies is very important in GED. The 13 colonies were, and you do not need to know this off by heart, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut. Those are the areas that were in New England, north of New York. And then in the New York area, you had New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and then moving further south along the coast, you get Maryland, Delaware, and then further south still, Virginia, and then the Carolinas, North Carolina, South Carolina, and then finally Georgia, the 13 English colonies. And I don't know how clear this is, but the darker red blob, those are the 13 colonies. The 13 colonies that England controlled. Now, these colonies had loyalty to Great Britain. They came from Great Britain. They relied on Britain for trade and favour. Their religion and traditions were similar. But as often happens, as these colonies became larger and wealthier, they really needed Britain less and less. But Britain felt they owned these colonies, and Britain's empire was really starting to grow. And not only did they own these colonies needed to pay tax to the British Empire. And this tax was needed so they could invade more and more nations and make the British Empire ever larger. So as a result, they started raising more and more tax from the colonies. And this caused tremendous friction. You don't need to remember these taxes. You just need to understand that the colonies were loyal to Britain to start with. But as they got more confident and they could live their lives more independently, and as Britain acted in a more and more unfair way in terms of asking them to pay tax, in terms of not giving them rights of decisions over taxes, the friction began. The animosity began. Here are some of these taxes. The Sugar Act of 1764. So sugar was taxed, but coffee and cloth were taxed. If you put a stamp on an official document, and this was something that was done a lot in those days, there was a tax on that. lead, glass, paper, paint and tea, all these items that were imported from Britain, they had to pay taxes on. And they started to get fed up about this. They couldn't make decisions about these taxes. They were implemented upon them, and they felt this was not right. They resisted. The way they resisted was they stopped buying English goods. The tax officials from England that came to America were threatened with violence. In reaction, Britain did repeal, which means removed some of these taxes, but they didn't remove all of them. There was a particularly famous there was a particularly famous massacre in 1770 where 5 colonists who were resisting England and English taxes were killed by British soldiers. There was something called in 1773 the Boston Tea Party, and this is where the American colonists, fed up with the taxes they had to pay on tea, the monopoly that the English had on their tea, went to Boston Harbour, where much of the tea from England had arrived, and threw the tea into the harbour. The colonists got together and formed their own congress to discuss the situation. They met in Philadelphia in Pennsylvania in 1774, demanded that the intolerable acts be repealed. They said that they wanted to have the same rights as other English citizens and that they should not be taxed without their agreement. Britain's reply: they sent soldiers. They sent 3,000 soldiers to Boston. They sent the Navy to stop any ship entering or leaving Boston Harbour. They weren't prepared to have dialogue. Then the first fighting came. April 1775, the first fighting of what would become the War of Independence, a successful war that the Americans, although outnumbered, managed to beat the British Army, arguably the strongest army in the world. The British General Thomas Gage, and his men tried to destroy the colonists' weapons and ammunition store in Concord, which is in New England. The colonists stopped them at Lexington. Colonists are killed. Quite a lot of colonists are killed. 1 British soldier is wounded. But the British retreat to Boston. And on that retreat, a lot of British soldiers are killed. And the war really starts to heat up. What we're going to do now, we've entered the War of Independence, is we're going to finish there and then go through some questions. Remembering, as you're going to see again with these questions, that these questions do not rely on you learning everything that I've taught you. They rely on you understanding everything that I've taught you. So we've got a first GED example question here. It's a line graph. This is all about whether you can accurately interpret a line graph. It says, please focus only on the blue line, the white colonists, when answering the 2 questions. And what they mean by the blue line is this line. So ignore the other lines, only look at this line here. And you'll see from the questions they're saying, how good are you at looking at a graph, interpreting a graph? With some of your knowledge of the fact of the colonists arriving in New England, it says population of the New England colonies. You know about the English arriving in New England. You've got some views about, or you know about that it was quite a successful. Quite a lot of them came, as you can see from the graph. So let's see if we can answer the questions. We'll go to the question and we'll come back to the graph. So question 1. Which conclusion can be drawn based on the graph, from the blue line in the graph? A. Colonists became increasingly dissatisfied with their decision to come to New England. B. colonists became increasingly satisfied with their decision to come to New England. C, colonists came to the New England colonies in decreasing numbers. And D, colonists came to the New England colonies in increasing numbers over time. Well, if we go back to it, so I think it can't be A, colonists became increasingly dissatisfied, because if they become so increasingly dissatisfied, you wouldn't have had this huge rise in the number of people staying there. If they didn't like it, they wouldn't come in such numbers. So I don't think it's going to be A. Colonists became increasingly satisfied with their decision to come to the New England. Well, B certainly looks possible, because if they're increasingly satisfied, that might encourage this growth in the line. Let's look at C. Colonists came to the New England colonies in decreasing numbers. Well, that's certainly not true, is it? Because you can see that they're coming in increasing numbers. This line is getting ever steeper. So that's not true. And D, colonists came to the New England colonies in increasing numbers over time. Well, I think that is even better than B, because we can guess that they were increasingly satisfied with their decision. We don't know that from the graph. Based on the graph, we don't know that. We can surmise it, but we don't know it. But colonists came to the New England colonies in increasing numbers. We can definitely see that in the graph. That's exactly what the graph is telling us, because the graph is getting ever steeper. So the answer to question 1 is D. Let's look at question 2. Which statement accurately reflects the data in the graph? A, the fewest colonists arrived in the colonies after 1750. Let's have a look at the graph. Well, the graph only goes to 1750, so that it doesn't give you any information about after 1750. So it can't be A. B, the greatest number of colonists arrived in the New England colonies before 1620. Well, the graph only starts in 1620, so it doesn't tell you anything about that, so it can't be B. More than 300 colonists had arrived in the New England colonies by 1750. 1750, 300 more, just over 300,000 had arrived. Looks like C is the correct answer, but let's have a look at D before we write C down. More than 100,000 colonists had arrived in the New England colonies by 1640. Let's have a look. 1640, well, that's certainly not true. Rather less than. Well, we're looking at a rather smaller number than that. So the answer to this question is C. More than 300,000 colonists had arrived in the New England colonies by 1750, because you can see that there. Now let's move on to another one. This is a good example of, before we've done interpreting a graph. This is interpreting a reading. This reading is a tough reading, because this reading was written more than 200 years ago. So the English and the writing is difficult. It was written by a man called Thomas Jefferson, who we might hear a lot about, and it's about it's about Benjamin Franklin. "I have made it a rule," said he, "whenever in my power, to avoid becoming the draftsman of papers to be reviewed by a public body.